So this is a talk that I originally gave almost 4 years ago to the day, and I don't know that anybody who's in the room was at that talk, so if you were, then you're going to see a lot of stuff you saw before. But and this is basically, I was asked to do this 4 years ago by some students who were going into their final year of their PhD and trying to figure out how they got a job after they got a PhD, and so that's basically what this is about. To give you some disclaimers, right, I'm going to talk about finding academic jobs and things like that, and I'm going to talk mostly from my experiences and from what I see. So part of what you have to keep in mind is that I'm an applied mathematician. I know nothing about the job market in algebra. I know nothing about algebra, and so I can't tell you anything about that job market. People have different experiences. The job market, of course, changes from time to time as the economy changes, as education becomes more or less important to state governments and things like that. And so, you know, my experiences have been informed by the times in which I've been on the job market. In particular, something that's going to be relevant is that my focus has always been on being a research active faculty member. And that's not a prerequisite. That's not necessarily why you're all here to get a PhD. And so that's just what I wanted and what I've got. And if that's not what you want, then we'll talk a little bit about what else is out there. Because if the job is a value judgment, right? It's a job that makes you happy and gives you enough money that you can survive and all those sorts of things. And so, you know, the bottom line is I'll tell you about what I've experienced, but, you know, that's not what you're necessarily going to experience. To tell you about what I've experienced, so I got my PhD from the University of Colorado in 2004. I did a 3-year postdoc at 3 different places, or rather I did 3 one-year postdocs. I moved around a bit partly because I'm married and my wife also is a scientist and we like living together. And so we moved around to places. So I stayed in Colorado as a postdoc for a year while my wife finished her PhD. We went to the University of Minnesota where she had a great postdoc opportunity for the 2005-2006 academic year. And then we moved to the Netherlands where I had a great opportunity for the next academic year. And then I showed up here about 4.5 years ago now. And this is no longer an accurate slide, or won't be as of September when I won't be an assistant professor anymore, so I had to put that up there. And relevant to this talk, you know, I've had some postdocs, I've turned down some postdocs, I've applied for a lot of faculty positions, I've interviewed for some faculty positions, I have a faculty position, and I've been on the hiring side now as well, which is actually really interesting, and I'm happy to talk a bit about that as well in terms of what I look for when I'm reading an application package from a job candidate. The other important thing is that I have a really cute baby. Here she is. The colors are a little bit off. There she is, about a day old. There she is, about 2 or 3 days old. There she is, around 5 months or something like that. And that's end of last summer, I guess that is, around September or something like that. There she is at Christmas. And there she is 2-3 weeks ago, I guess. Right next time.
That's why you got a promotion.
So anyway, she's really cute and I really love her, and but that's not what we're here to talk about. I could show you pictures of my daughter for an hour. But I won't. So the first thing you have to know is that when you're applying for jobs, you're going to see lots and lots of different terms that may or may not make any logical sense. Here are some of them, and often their interpretations. So postdoc, when people talk about a postdoc, they often talk about a research job, separate from a job where you're mostly teaching. We'll talk about some of those distinctions as we go forward. And if it's a research position, it's usually paid by somebody's grant. Somebody has a grant from the NSF or the UE or something like that, and they're paying you to do research. Sometimes as a postdoc you do some teaching. Sometimes we talk about really teaching jobs and we just call them postdocs in the sense that you have a doc and so you're now a postdoc, and that makes it a postdoc. There are two different names that are often used for primarily teaching positions. One is instructor and one is lecturer. And they're not consistently used, but typically instructor is used for a teaching position that might be a tenure track teaching position. So a teaching position that becomes a permanent teaching position. And lecturer is often used for a teaching position that has a fixed term to it, and then it finishes. We at Tufts use the terms lecturer and senior lecturer, not implying that these are fixed-term positions, just implying that we use the terminology differently than other places do. And so, but you'll see job advertisements for both instructors and lecturers, and they may or may not mean exactly the same thing. You'll also see job advertisements for assistant professors. Assistant professor is a generic name for a junior faculty position. It may be fixed term, where you have a fixed length contract, 2 years, 3 years, something like that. It may be a named assistant professor, a Norbert Wiener assistant professor, or other places have different names. Those are also often fixed term positions. Often we use the name to distinguish between a tenure track assistant professor, that is a position that might become permanent if you get tenure, and a term limited position that doesn't become a permanent one. And so we call them Norbert Wiener assistant professors now because that's a name, and he's a Tufts graduate. Different places have different names depending on which of their famous alumni they choose to honor in this way, or who gave them money to do it. And then you won't be looking at this yet, but of course, many people have the goal of becoming a tenured faculty member, given that you have a permanent position, so long as you don't do anything really stupid. You'll see different contracts for 9 or 12 months. That's the portion of the calendar year in which you're under contract, the portion of the year for which you're paid. Most tenure track faculty positions in the US are 9-month positions, meaning that you do summer school teaching or research, or you go off and have adventures over the summer, depending on what you want. Internationally, typically it's a 12-month position. So even in Canada, in Europe, most places you have a 12-month position. The American system is kind of unique that you have a 9-month position. You often get paid well enough in that 9-month position that you don't have to do anything over the summer, but if you do stuff over the summer, you get paid extra. Or you do things like do your research so you get tenure. And then often you'll see discussions of course loads and these sorts of things. What is the teaching expectation? At Tufts we teach 2 and 2. You'll see places that teach 2 and 1, 3 and 2, all sorts of combinations. So this is the lingo. You're going to be looking at job ads at some point and you're going to see all of these sorts of things coming up. And they're not always meaning the same thing, but this is generally how things are going to break down.
What's a 2 and 2?
So 2 and 2 means you teach 2 courses per semester. And this is actually another good point, is most places in the US are on the semester system, right? So we teach in the fall and we teach in the spring, and you teach 2 courses in the fall and 2 in the spring. 2 and 1 doesn't necessarily mean 2 in the fall and 1 in the spring. It means one semester you teach 1 and one semester you teach 2. Schools that are on quarter systems, they have 3 teaching quarters throughout the year, and a typical teaching load at a quarter system school is 2-2-2 or 2-2-1 or 2-1-1 or something along those lines. So, other questions? You should interrupt me with questions. Okay, so here's the deal. You're hopefully going to get a Ph.D., or at least that's who I'm talking to, so my apologies to the master's student or students here. You're not going to get a job as tenure track faculty at a research active school right away. And so I'd like to distinguish a little bit between research active schools or research active departments and not research active schools or non-research active departments, in the sense that in the department you're in now, the faculty do research. And that is an expectation. We're involved in our research, we publish, we get grants, all those sorts of things. You'll also see schools where the entire university is not research active, or you'll see departments where, and it does happen for math departments at schools that have research in some areas, but they only have a math department to teach math to the undergrads in other departments. And so if you're thinking about a research active school, you're thinking about a school like Tufts or a state university, a big name state university, those sorts of things. Those are sort of research active schools, and they're just not going to hire you as a new PhD in a tenure track job. That just generally doesn't happen. It doesn't mean you shouldn't apply for those jobs, it just means you shouldn't be expecting to get one right out of your PhD. So what are your options instead? Well, you can look for a postdoc or an instructor type position in a research active department. You could look for a tenure track position in a teaching focused department. Schools that really have a teaching focus or departments that have a teaching focus often do hire new PhDs into tenure track positions. You could look for a postdoc position outside academia at some sort of research institute, or you could get what we like to call a real job. That is a job in industry, or go to work for a bank or a company or something like that. So those are your big sort of broad options. And to talk about those in a little bit more detail, postdoc has a bunch of different meanings, but generically it's just your first job after you finish your PhD. And it breaks down as there's actually a bunch of different types of postdocs. So often the research positions where you're paid by a grant specifically to do some sort of research. Those are the sorts of postdocs that I had. Any teaching I did as a postdoc was purely incidental. It was professional development, but it wasn't a contractual part of my job. You will also see research positions that have minimal teaching sort of contractually. You teach one course a year, maybe even one course a semester, and those are often spelled out in the job ad. You'll see teaching positions with minimal research, so you'll be teaching, say, 2 courses a semester, and you're expected to also do research as part of that, but your main focus is teaching. This is the model that we use for the Norbert Wiener assistant professors here, is that they're here to teach 2 and 2 and do research in the rest of their time. And you'll also see teaching positions where you really have 40 hours a week to do of teaching, and any research you do is on your own time beyond that. And so those are teaching positions where, maybe you're teaching 3 courses a year. So those are more instructorships or lectureships or things like that. Research positions are not always advertised, but teaching positions really almost are always advertised. And this is something that's really changed in the last few years. Everybody uses math jobs now. Even universities that don't use math jobs to collect applications still typically advertise their positions on mathjobs.org. And that's sort of the clearinghouse for jobs, primarily in the US, but also internationally. Most jobs go to math jobs. The ones that don't end up in math jobs, and most of the ones that do, are also advertised in these other places. So in my field, the Numerical Analysis Digest or the High Performance Computing Wire are weekly email lists that send out a lot of job advertisements along with conference announcements and all those sorts of things. Both SciAm and the AMS have job websites that are really good, and again, they get a lot of things posted. Or department websites, if you want to get a job in a particular school or a particular place or things like that, you can look directly at the departments that are there and look at their websites. For these sorts of postdoc positions, teaching positions are almost always advertised in some combination of these sorts of things. Research positions are not, and part of the reason for that is that research positions are typically created as contracts to get something done. And so the PI on the grant that's created that position is looking to hire specifically someone to get something done. And so they're not necessarily advertising, they're talking to their friends. They're talking to other faculty and things like that.
What is a PI?
Principal investigator.
Okay.
So the person who well, okay, so it's very complicated, but the person who signs the contract with the agency to do the grant is some administrator. They're up on Professor's Row here. The person who signs off on this is how we're spending money on the grant is the principal investigator, the PI. And so that's the person who has sort of overall control of the sort of administrative and scientific ends of a project. And so on the Poincaré, for example, Montserrat's the PI. I'm the PI on a couple of grants and those sorts of things. So yeah. And so those research positions are, sometimes advertised if somebody is sort of looking for sort of a particular skill set or something like that. But more often, those are things that you get by word of mouth. You can also apply for grants that fund a postdoc. And so usually you apply for a specific project at a specific place. And so that's the model, say, that the NSF uses for their postdoc grants. So both Aaron Monroe and Aaron Brown got NSF postdocs. Aaron Monroe went to Boston University to work with Nancy Coppell's group on neuroscience, and Aaron Brown went to Penn State to work with one of Morris's.
Those are grad students that work here.
Yes, those are people who, in fact, who were in the room the last time I gave this talk. Other countries also have science foundations that give out grants. The European Union has this sort of centralized under the Marie Curie programs. Those are great programs that pay really, really well to go internationally, to go to Europe, if you're coming from the States to do research. Or there's private foundations, Ford Foundation, Humboldt Foundation, and things like that. You should be aware that these are out there for you, and you should be thinking about these long before you actually graduate. Typically, at least a year before you actually graduate, you need to be thinking about these sorts of applications. And so if you're coming up on what you think is going to be your final year, obviously that's sometimes a nebulous sort of thing, you should be starting to think about doing these sorts of applications. And oftentimes, I know for a fact with the Marie Curie program, and I think with some of the other ones as well, you do have the option to defer a year. It's also true with the NSF that you can defer for a year. So if you haven't quite graduated when you thought you would be graduating, when you put in the application, you can defer for a year. Or if you had to wait, this is true of the Marie Curie, is if you had to wait so long to find out if you were going to get this position funded, that you had to take another job to make sure that you could eat for the next year, then you can also defer for things like that.
Are the NSF postdocs just for American institutions?
Yes, although there are some international programs that I think the NSF participates in. But typically the NSF has to be, I believe it's both, American citizen, American institution. Yeah. Other questions?
Do you know what the breakdown of applied versus pure grants from the NSF are?
No. So the way, what I can tell you is the way the NSF works is that, and so this is something that is worth knowing. They divvy up things like their grad student grants and their postdoc grants based on number of applications. And so math as a group gets, you know, X percentage of them based on having X percentage of the applications. And so it's worth applying because then more mathematicians get them. But in terms of the pure versus applied, that's like a within the math sort of thing that things break down. And so in principle, and so this is always hard, right, because you're comparing apples and oranges in the sense that you're comparing somebody who wants to go off and do some really cool thing in group theory with somebody who wants to go off and do some real cool approximation theory or something like that. And you know, these things are in the end comparisons based on letters of reference. This person is the best grad student from this school in N years versus this person who was the third best from some other school and things like that. So
it's a single pool for all fields? For them.
So what they do is they break them up for reviews into different fields. But you know, in the end, DMS is the Division of Mathematical Sciences at NSF, and they get some amount of dollars to give out. And they, I'm sure, divvy it up a little bit internally, but I don't know what the exact ratios are. I don't know that they publicize. Other questions? So I mean, these are all out there as another way, and so this is a great way of getting the postdoc that you really want, right? In the sense that you're in control of saying, this is where I want to go, this is what I want to work on. Whereas if you go with these sorts of other routes, what you're looking at is what's available when I'm graduating. And I've gone both routes in terms of positions. So I had a couple of research positions that were not advertised that came from talking to PIs and figuring out grants and things like that. One of them was with the group that I did my PhD with, and so that was a pretty easy one to talk my way into. And then I had one that was a Marie Curie fellowship that had me in the Netherlands for about a year and a half or something. And so, you know, it all works out, right? You hope to get a job somewhere where you're doing something interesting.
How long do these grants usually last?
Oftentimes the grants are 2 years for a postdoc. I know NSF you can extend it to 3 years if you teach. And so that's something with the NSF you sort of have to plan up front that over the 3 years you have to teach so many courses to stretch it to be a 3-year grant. Otherwise it's 2 years if you do no teaching. You know, for the Marie Curie ones I know that those are 12 to 24 months and you ask for however long you want it to be when you apply. And other sorts of things have different rules. Typically, the expectation, I should say, I guess, is that if you're going this route where you're going from a PhD to some sort of postdoctoral work to a tenure-track faculty position in a research-active department, the expectation is you're going to spend somewhere between maybe 2 and 5 years as a postdoc. Less than 2 years, and you're still sort of too fresh to be competitive against people who are in that 2 to 5 year range, where they've been out long enough, they've got, you know, everything from their thesis has been published, they've got publications independently of what they did in their thesis and things like that. That's sort of the track that we're looking at. Talk about that a little bit more in the sort of second half of the talk when I'm talking about your application materials. And then if you've sort of been out 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, 10 years, and you still haven't gotten that first university job, then people start to look at you and say, well, this guy who's only been out 3 years has, you know, a comparable record to this person who's been out 8 years. And so you sort of go with the younger person at that stage because they're being more productive per year since their PhD. Those are some comparisons that do get made. And so you should be thinking that you're doing at least a postdoc if you want that research job. And maybe you're doing 2, but you know, 2 3-year type postdocs. And so, but by the time you're in your 5th year, your 6th year, you're at that critical point where you need to be getting a tenure-track job. And so that's what happens. fixed-term assistant professorships, named assistant professorships, are really common in math departments and not at all common in other departments. We're the only department on the Tufts campus that does this. But every math department basically does this. So they give you the same or similar teaching as a tenure track assistant professor. You get to set your sort of independent research agenda. You have this 2 to 3 year fixed term. And if there's active research in what you're doing in the department, these can be really great, right? You're getting teaching experience. You get to collaborate with people who are doing what you're doing. And so this is everything you're going to need to get a job, a permanent job on the other end of it. But you could also be sitting in your corner with nobody to talk to. And so you have to think a little bit about what the connections are for you in that department. And I know people who've gone, Professor Adler, for example, had one of these positions at Penn State, and he got some great research done while he's there. He got a position after, I think, just 2 years there here, and we like him. And so, that sort of worked out really well for him, but I know of other people who've had sort of less good experiences where they went somewhere, even they thought that they were going to get some work done with some, big name in their field, and the big name turns out to be somebody who doesn't show up except to teach their class and doesn't talk to anybody, and so you're sitting by yourself with no one to talk to but yourself. And so, that's something you have to be really careful of when you're looking at these positions. It's something hiring committees are very careful of. So when we hire these positions, we really hire thinking about who is this person going to work with. And we see great applicants, people who have good publication records, everything we're looking for, but their research is just not close enough to the research of the faculty in the department. And those people we just don't hire, we don't interview them, we don't make them offers, because it wouldn't be fair to bring a person into that situation, in our view. But other schools maybe aren't quite so careful depending on their view of these positions. It's easy to view these sorts of positions as somebody who's going to come in and teach and you don't care what else they're doing. And then there's teaching jobs where, frankly, there are schools that really don't care what you do for your research. I know of people at schools where they were told, we expect one paper to be published before you go up for tenure. And that can be a paper from your thesis. Or there are schools that expect, in the time you're a tenure track assistant professor, you will publish 1 or 2 papers. Or maybe they'll say 1 creative work per year, where that might be you went to a conference and gave a talk, or you published a paper, or you did something else. And so, there are a lot of jobs out there that have very little interest in your research. And if you're the sort of person who really enjoys teaching and doesn't really enjoy research, then these might be jobs that you really like. Lots of people I know who have these jobs are really, really happy people. So I don't want to, a lot of people will suggest to you, not so much here, but in lots of places I've been, people will suggest to you that these are bad jobs. And they'll say these are bad jobs because you're teaching 3 courses per semester, or even 4 courses per semester. When are you going to do your research? But if you don't like your research, then you might like a job like this. Or if you really enjoy interacting with undergrads, doing research with undergrads and things like that, these can be really great jobs. And so they have low expectations. Certainly this is the case at 2-year colleges. If you're looking at sort of the community college, 2-year college type model, there they really don't care about your research. I don't know of any community colleges that hire based on research expertise. But it's also true of some liberal arts schools. Some really good liberal arts schools. They're just not really interested in research except in undergrad student research. Fact of the matter is they pay less. You make more money in a research active department. Money isn't everything, and so if you really enjoy this sort of thing, then that's what you should be looking for.
What's the median research expectation? So like the joke line is 1 by the time you get your tenure track, but what if you went to a research institution or even like when you go up for tenure at Tufts, what would they expect? How many papers per year would they expect?
So that's a great question because nobody will answer that question. But what I was told, and in fact the interesting thing is, Tufts was wonderful for me going up for tenure in a number of different ways. Right, there are senior people in this department who've been very involved in the tenure and promotion process across the campus, and so they know how to give you that sort of advice in a much more direct way. But also one of the things Tufts does for incoming faculty is they hook you up with senior faculty out of the department who can also give you that advice. And so the advice I got from people out of this department was basically they're looking for about 2 papers per year, sustained over those 4 or 5 years before you go up for your tenure review. And so that's what Tufts was looking for. I can tell you that at MIT, they don't give you that sort of specific advice, but MIT cares much more about the visibility of your work than the quantity of your work. And so, if you're publishing in Annals or some big name journal and you're only publishing 1 paper a year, that might be enough to get you tenure at a place like MIT. It might not be though too, because it's MIT and they don't tend to give tenure. Whereas, I certainly know concretely of people who are at schools that it's sort of more like 1 paper per year or less. And so, that's the ballpark though, I would say. In a research active department, 1 or 2 papers per year. It also depends a lot on pure versus applied. Tufts isn't so divisive that way, but pure math department, I think the expectations are fewer longer papers, whereas in an applied math department, more shorter papers. So the standard papers that I publish are 20 to 30 pages. For me to publish a paper longer than 30 pages requires an explanation to the editor of the journal as to why this paper should be longer than 30 pages, and that's not the case for some of the pure math journals and things like that. So that's sort of a hard thing to give you a concrete number on. And it's very field specific, right? And so what we see at Tufts is a lot of the humanists, they don't write articles, they write books. And so they are expected to have a book published and a second book under contract by the time they come up for their tenure, which means that they basically published their PhD dissertation as a book, and they're now substantially through their second book. But that's a philosopher, not a mathematician. Other questions here?
Yeah, so is it possible to get hired for a position that's maybe seems temporary and definitely not tenure track, and then they decide they really like you and they want to put you on tenure track?
So it happens, but it's an institution-specific thing. In the institutional memory of this department, there has been one, well, it wasn't a Norbert Wiener assistant professor at the time, but one Norbert Wiener assistant professor who was hired tenure track, and there has been one person who was hired as a part-time lecturer who was hired tenure track, and only one of those 2 people is still here. And that's in 35 years. And here, if we wanted to do that, we would have to make a very serious case as to why we were doing it, because it smacks of favoritism, right? We're supposed to be hiring the best person for the job, and if we say, hey, the best person for the job is this guy in the next office, we really have to go out of our way to justify that to the administration. Other schools have fewer qualms with favoritism, and so it does happen, I think, more commonly at places other than this department. Oftentimes that's something which is laid out ahead of time. And so when we hire a Norbert Wiener assistant professor, we say, this is a 3-year position, and the expectation is it is 3 years and you're gone. And there's no chance of this becoming a tenure track position. But it does vary. Yeah. And so actually, so this is a good point, is sometimes you'll have to decide between taking a temporary position at a place where you'd like to be long-term and taking a temporary position at a place where you'd not like to be long-term. Sometimes it makes sense to go where you don't want to be so that you can move into a permanent position where you do want to be. Also, what's true is universities, with a few exceptions, very rarely hire their own PhDs as tenure track faculty members. Right? There's nobody in this department who got their PhD from Tufts. Not that we don't like Tufts PhDs, it's just that we tend to think that it's better to get some mixing up, right? To send people out and get people in with different perspectives.
Are there long terms, longer than 3 years at least, that are not tenure?
Yes. So a lot of positions that are labeled as instructors or lecturers or things like that can be longer term positions. Sometimes they are 3 years renewable or something like that, 2 years renewable, or even renewable year to year, things like that. The specific details vary, but it's certainly true in the US. Typically what happens is those are positions that are more teaching focused, or they are positions that are fully research funded, where you start as a postdoc and then you become what we call a research assistant professor, which is somebody who is a sort of permanent researcher, but they're not actually paid by the university, they're paid directly off of grants and things like that. Internationally, there are a lot more positions that are longer term but not tenured. And so these vary from country to country depending on how things happen. So in Germany, for example, now they're what they call these junior professor positions that I think are now like a 5-year type commitment. Possibly renewable, possibly not, and things like that. But you know, the German system is migrating from a system whereby you got your PhD, you worked as a postdoc for about 5 years, you wrote a habilitation, and then you became eligible for a permanent position. And so now, instead of having that postdoc time, they have that time as a junior professor. There's no habilitation required anymore, but you have to have a body of work equivalent to what would have gone into it. In the Netherlands, in contrast, even an assistant professor position is a permanent position. And so there are people who work for 40 years as an assistant professor, and they do that because being an assistant professor in that system is a nice job. It's a teaching job, and so they do very little research, but they teach, but they're a tenured assistant professor for their whole time. Yeah. And different countries have just different histories and those sorts of things.
There are faculty in this department that have been here more than a decade that are not tenure track.
Yes, exactly. Although the administration in this university distinguishes very carefully between what they call lecturers and what they call faculty, or lecturers and professors. And that's a distinction that applies in this department. Yeah. But it's true that there are people in this department who have been here much longer than I have and are not tenured. Yeah. Other questions? All right. And then the last thing, I guess, another option for you is to look at postdocs outside of universities. And so these can be in places like national labs. Department of Energy has a lot of postdocs. These can be in commercial labs. Both IBM and Schlumberger, big multinational corporations, hire PhDs to do research. The NSA is not up there, but it should be up there. The National Security Administration, they tend to hire pure mathematician PhDs, sometimes for permanent positions, sometimes for term positions. And then this list of acronyms on the third bullet. IMA is the Institute for Mathematics and its Applications. PIMS is the Pacific Institute of Mathematical Sciences. SAMSI is the S is statistics. One of the S's is statistics. It's in North Carolina. I think it's the Statistics and Applied Math Something Institute, or the Something Applied Math and Statistics Institute. Is in North Carolina. There's also whatchamacallit out in Berkeley.
MSRI.
MSRI, thank you. Mathematics, statistics.
Anyway.
Yeah, there's lots of them, right? And a lot of those places have postdocs. And in fact, one of the nice things that happened in the US when the economy tanked was that the federal government gave all of these places more money to hire more postdocs for a few years. That money is running out, and it's not clear if there's going to be a second infusion of money or not. But those places did. And then sort of internationally, there's various national research centers in mathematics that do this. And so the one that I know is in the Netherlands. It's the Center for Mathematics and Computer Science in Amsterdam. But there's lots of other ones. And so these all hire people with PhDs. These are research-focused positions. These are positions where you're doing research, you're publishing research, and you're doing all of the things that an academic job would expect of you as a postdoc. And so it's easy to go back to an academic job from one of those positions.
Will these sorts of jobs be posted on Mass Jobs?
Yeah, totally. You know, I know for a fact that the IMA does, and SAMSI and MSRI all post those sorts of things.
These are not in universities, so they're necessarily 12-month workload.
They're typically 12 months, exactly, yeah. But again, that's something that can vary, and they specify it in the ad. Yeah.
Is it ever the case that you get one of these jobs and they prevent you from publishing? Like if you get a job at the NSA, can they prevent you from publishing?
So that's something that happens. And so what's not up here is the DoD labs, like Lincoln Labs. And there, I know a guy who was there, and he was working on classified projects, and so they weren't publishing. He's now back in academia, but he sort of retooled. He worked there post-PhD for several years. He got a PhD in operator theory, I think. Went there, did very applied work for a number of years, and then he went and did a postdoc, actually at the IMA, and sort of reinvented himself as a university mathematician. But you know, the disadvantage of doing that, where you don't publish for a few years, and this is perhaps also applicable to Professor Hooft in this department, he was working in industry for a number of years, is you're a little bit older when you get that first tenure track job. And so, you know, I'm in my 30s and I now have tenure and things like that, whereas I know people who get tenure in their 40s, and that's fine, right? I mean, as long as you're not, starving or, those sorts of things. As long as you're doing something that you're enjoying and you're making enough money to live, then it's no big deal if you want to go back into academia and get tenure at some point. And these positions, particularly things like NSA and DoD labs, pay quite well, and so that's not a big deal. But when you start to think about retirement benefits and all that sort of stuff, sometimes it's nice to have tenure earlier. So yeah, other questions? So the long-term view in all of this is, what do you want, right? So I wanted a faculty position in a research active department, and so I did very research-focused postdocs. I have colleagues who wanted a faculty position in a teaching-focused department, and they did very teaching-focused postdocs. Or maybe you want something else, in which case I can't really help you, but I can give you pointers to companies that hire people with PhDs in math. If you want to be in a research active department, you need to be a research active person. And so that may not sound very shocking, but people do miss out on that point, that there are people who get a PhD, and then they go off and they teach 3 courses a semester for 5 years, and then they try and go back to a research-oriented department, and the research-oriented departments look at them and say, but you haven't published anything in the last 5 years. And there's a good reason for that, but there are people who've been out the same amount of time who have been publishing who look better qualified for that same job. And so you're always trying to think about who you're going to be up against for the job that you really want. And so if you want a research active job, you should be doing a research postdoc. You should be at an institute or a lab or a university. You should be publishing, and you should be thinking about your publication record, and you should be going to conferences and talking to people at conferences, making sure that your work is out there, people see your work. If you want a teaching-focused job, then, again, the same thing happens in reverse, is that if a teaching-focused department or a department like ours is hiring for a teaching-focused job, we look at teaching. And so you get people who apply for a teaching-focused job, and they have a great publication record, but they've only taught like 3 courses in, 5 years, and then they're not competitive for that job. And so if you want a teaching-focused job, look at doing a teaching postdoc, look at getting classroom experience, or look at going into one of those right away from your PhD. That's something oftentimes people can get into a tenure track teaching position right away from their PhD. Especially if, like here, you're getting teaching experience along the way, you're TAing, you're in the classroom as the instructor of record, you're teaching summer school, all of those sorts of things help you with those sorts of jobs. But that's something I can't decide for you, right? I got a job that I really like, but I really like it because I'm me and it works, right? But that's not something that necessarily has to work for you. And so those are what's out there. And now you have to say, well, how do I get a job? For a postdoc, it's actually not so hard. You ask people. Because you need to figure out what's out there. Not everything is advertised. Your advisor, there may be people around here who disagree with me, but my opinion is that if I'm your advisor, I'm responsible for making sure you get a job. And so Matt has a job, and so there's proof that, he did this. Except he got it totally independent. So if you want an academic job, you should be talking to people, going to conferences, talking to your committee members, talking to other faculty in the department, talking to their colleagues, talking to, your colleagues at other institutions, all those sorts of things. Ask around, figure out where there are jobs, figure out where you want to be, look at the AMS or the SIAM job websites, look at the print stuff that comes out in the SIAM news or the AMS notices. Look at mathjobs.org, definitely look at mathjobs.org, figure out what's out there, talk to people about what's out there, look at the grant announcements that are coming around, and these are things that happen every year at the same time every year, so you should know when they're coming up. When you're getting close to graduating, you should be thinking about what you need to do to get onto those sorts of programs. But just be aware of it, right? A job may fall into your lap. That actually happens more often than it should, but you shouldn't be planning on having a job fall into your lap. You should be doing something proactive to get that job. Faculty positions are a little more standardized, and so the deal is the job advertisements come out in the fall. And again, AMS, SIAM carry them, most of them are on math jobs. Applications are due sometime there's been some deadline creep. You know, everybody wants to get just a little bit ahead of everybody else. And so November to February is maybe a little bit optimistic. It's more like 1st of October through February now for those sorts of deadlines. And they still continue, right? So things happen like, you know, the last minute a department realizes that they have a need for someone to fill some sort of role, and they advertise a position in March or in April. So you keep an eye on these things until you have a job. But you should definitely be looking as early as sort of September for jobs for the following September. So it's a full year type process. Interviews are going to happen typically in early spring. I know a few places now are pushing them before sort of the Christmas, New Year's break, but typically they happen January and forward. Job offers happen sort of February and forward, depending on the timelines of the search. And then you start in the fall, or maybe lots of places will hire you and immediately put you on leave. That's what happened for me, is I was hired in early 2007, and I took a leave for the fall 2007 semester, and I started here in 2008. You know, that's sort of the timeline that you should be expecting. And that's pretty standard, particularly amongst American institutions. European institutions hire on a slightly later time frame. And so that's maybe happening a bit more like now. When we've hired recently, you know, tenure track positions, we interview in January. Basically, second half of January is when we do our interviews. We try and get an offer out early in February. And part of that is because that's what our competition is doing, right? So we're trying to hire the same people that other great schools are trying to hire, and we want to make sure that we're at least letting them think about our offer before they have to answer another offer. But searches happen in all sorts of wild and crazy ways, and so you know, I know of big name research departments that, you know, this year made offers in April for positions, and so, you know, there's a wide range of timing that happens there. What you're going to need for that faculty application is basically these sorts of things. You're going to need a cover letter, you're going to need a vita, you're going to need reference letters, a teaching statement, and a research statement. The specifics about these things sort of vary, how many reference letters, what sort of teaching statement, and all that sort of stuff. I'll talk through some of those sorts of things, but this is what you're going to need. So now you know, and none of you are applying for jobs for next September, I hope. And so get going, right? There's no excuse for being a PhD student who doesn't have a vita. At the very least, you're in a PhD program, you have a bachelor's degree, you've taken some courses, and so there's start of a vita, and then when you start going to conferences or giving presentations or going through your PhD coursework and all those sorts of things and the requirements, those sorts of things go on your vita. And you just sort of add as you do things. Being involved as an officer in OGSM or the GSC, those are the sorts of things that should be on your vita. And so get that going, and just keep it up to date. Do it in tech. You should all know tech. Do it in tech and just add things as you go along. You know, every faculty member in this department just updates their vita whenever we get around to it, or in February, because that's when we have to send it to the administration every year.
Are there, like, so there are a lot of differences between a vita and a resume.
Yeah.
But like, length, is it less important, like, is it more important that your vita is comprehensive and less important that it's short?
Yes and no.
Okay.
So I've got a slide on vita in 2 slides, and so we'll talk about that specific question, and if I forget, remind me. I first want to talk about the cover letter, because that's the first thing that you have to submit. So let me go back. So I look at hiring somebody, right? I'm on the search committee. I log into mathjobs.org. I have a special username and password that lets me look at everybody who's applied to the job. And there's 100 of them. And I click on Arthur Aardvark because he's first, because they're often listed alphabetically. And then this is there for me, right? And there's a few other things, you know, I get to see your AMS subject classification and your current institution and when you got your PhD and all that sort of stuff, but basically I have links to PDFs with all of these sorts of things. And I'm a tab-oriented person, so I just open them all in tabs. But I go through and I look at the cover letter, the CV, then the reference letters, then the teaching and research statement. And so as I'm going through here, I'm getting either more and more interested or less and less interested. Right? But the first thing I look at is the cover letter, and basically what I expect to see in a cover letter is something pretty standard, right? Where did you get your PhD? What do you do your research in? Right? If I can't get that information from your cover letter, I'm annoyed. I want brief statements about your teaching and research. A paragraph, a short paragraph, that says, you know, this is my research and context and things like that. This is what I've taught. And if either of those is not very deep, that's okay. But, you know, just a little bit of information so that I can put this in context of the search. And typically it's good. Most people say, I am writing to apply for the X position in this department at this university starting in fall 2000 and whatever. Right? So there's sort of one sentence saying, this is what this is for. So that's the hard thing to do because, of course, that means you have to make sure that you're uploading new ones to Math Jobs for every position you're applying for, and you don't use the wrong one for, I've seen it, it happens. You'd think it wouldn't, but it happens. And then you want a little bit of personalization in the sense that, especially at the sort of the intro, the sort of first postdoc type jobs that you'll be applying for, you want to talk about why you're interested in being in this department. What's the research connection? Who in this department is the person you're going to work with? Or if it's a more specific research type one, why are you qualified to do the research that they're looking for someone to do? And if there's other professional attractions to the school, those are things that you might also want to include. I don't know about any of you. My wife's also a scientist. This is not the place necessarily to broach that you have a two-body problem, as we like to call it, or a two-body opportunity, as more optimistic people like to call it, unless that's important to you. Unless you're writing to say, I'm only interested in this job if there's also a job for my spouse. There's not really a place to put it in the cover letter. And so I have seen it happen, and we've never really used that tact, partly because we never really did. Partly because we have very independent careers and we're both relatively successful, and so we've never really felt like, you know, one of us is pulling the other one somewhere. But you know, the reason we're in Boston is because it was easy for us to get two positions in Boston. So you know, a little bit of personalization, but sort of some boilerplate. You know, I'm taking my first look at your file. Tell me what I'm going to see in your file, and then I'm going to go on to your CV. And this is really
question about the personal connections. Yeah. Like, if you say I am interested in doing research with so and so, have you usually already met them at a conference and like talked to them, or? Often,
yeah. Because what happens in that sort of statement is if I see that and it's somebody who I'm not sure about or whatever, I'm going to go to so and so and say, hey, what do you think of this person? Do you know them? And you know, the answer, if that person saying back to me, no, but I'll take a look, happens, right? But yeah, but it's good, or you can send them an email. I think somewhere later on I sort of say, you can always send people asking for advice. You know, introducing yourself and saying, can you tell me about opportunities for me within your department? And so that's a good way to sort of get that initial contact to somebody, especially if there's somebody who you really think you could have a productive research relationship with. Yeah. Other questions here? So in terms of the vita, this is where I'm looking to figure out who you are as an academic. And so I want to know about your degrees, and within that, any specializations or things that happen. I want to know what sort of academic jobs you've had, and that includes classroom teaching experience and things like that. It's also on there separately, but if you were a summer school instructor or things like that, it's kind of good to have that up front. I want to know about your publications, and I don't want to have to flip through 12 pages of CV to find your publications. Your publications need to be on like the first couple of pages, or else I'm getting grumpy. Because it's sad to say, but you know, one of the things that we really use to sort of filter the applications is we look and we see, how does this person present their research to the world? And so we're counting papers. And we're looking at the papers and we're looking at where were those papers published. And I've seen people who had, you know, people who were like 3 or 4 years out of their PhD, who had 20, 25 papers. That's incredible for somebody. And then you look at the journals and you're like, I would never publish in any of those journals because they're all really low tier journals. Whereas you also look at people who are, you know, just a few years out of their PhD, they have just a few publications, but they're in really good journals, and then that gives you a really positive impression. But you want to get that information out sort of early in your vita. That's what we're there for. So give it to us. You want to talk about conferences you've attended and particular presentations you've given. Again, this is something that I think varies a little bit between pure and applied, in that I send my students to conferences to give presentations. Whereas I think in some of the pure areas, you tend to be sent to conferences to hear presentations until you're sort of in your last year or something like that. And so, but if you've been attending those conferences, you want it on there, right? That shows that you're out there, that you know what the field is, that you're sort of involved in those sorts of things. If you have research grants, including things like NSF grad fellowships or those sorts of things, and those should be on there. Definitely if they were funded, but also to some extent if they were applied for, if there's sort of compelling reason. You don't want to be sending out a vita saying, here, hire me, here are 100 things I've applied for that I didn't get. But if you were nominated for something really special and you didn't get it, then still being nominated is worth putting on there. Definitely have your teaching experience, and then also your service. So have you been a referee? And if you want that experience of refereeing a paper, you might talk to your advisors. I don't know if it's many, but certainly several people in this department are on editorial boards, and we're always looking for referees. Or your advisor may send you the next paper that they get to referee so that you can do it for them. It's a great tactic. Talk about being involved in student groups, student government, all those sorts of things, right? Everything you're doing sort of service-wise should be on there. It needs to be nicely formatted and easy to read. White space is your friend. Right? I don't want this dense sort of document so that it all fits on one page, but you've got half-inch margins and 5-point font. At the same time, I don't want this to be 12 pages long. My vita that I send to the administration every year that gives them all of the things that I do is now probably 8 pages or something like that. But I'm 8 years out of my PhD. At the time where you're just finishing your PhD, a lot of people will tell you 1 page or 2 pages. If you need to go to 3 pages so that it's actually visually appealing, then go to 3 pages. Don't feel, a lot of people will tell you that there are rules for this, that it must be 1 page. Screw them. Tell the story you have to tell. Don't take too much space to do it just for the sake of taking up a lot of space and looking impressive, but don't put it all on 1 page for the sake of following somebody's rule and putting it all on 1 page.
So in an industry, it's 1 page, right? I think. You just don't
So
notice.
oftentimes for industrial positions, for a resume or something like that, it's 1 page and it's very, very brief. But things like publications, conferences, research grants, but most of those sorts of things are very brief if you're on an industrial vita or industrial resume. And things also evolve, right? When I was a grad student, I had conferences that I attended, and now I have some of the conferences that I've given presentations at on my vita. Right? It's not even an exhaustive list anymore. Things, my depth of information about my teaching experience gets shorter and shorter every time I revise my vita, just because there's other things that I want to highlight, and the teaching experience gets more and more repetitive. Right? I've taught Math 13 I don't know how many times now, and I really just need to tell you I've taught Math 13 n times, where n is a reasonably large integer. And that's enough information, right? The fact that I did it in spring 2012 and fall 2011 and I don't know when else doesn't matter as much anymore. But as you sort of go through your academic career, those are the sorts of things that are going to change for you. And that's something that really evolves over time as you sort of go through. The other thing I will point out is I've got up here publications and preprints. There's no standard for when you're allowed to put a paper on your CV. And so you will see CVs that only have published papers on them. They don't list anything that's been submitted, they don't list anything that's in progress or anything like that. It's just, here are the papers that I published. At your stage, I think that's a little bit optimistic, because oftentimes that list will have 0 things on it. And so if you've got publications that you've submitted that are in the refereeing process, it's good to put them on your vita. That's something that's complete except for the final stages of publication. So it's not stamped as being a good contribution to mathematics, but it's a complete thing that you've done that you can, hand to somebody if they want to read it. And I like that standard of, I could send you a PDF file if you wanted to read it, as being a sort of standard of whether or not something goes on your vita. And so my standard is, everything I've published is on my vita, things that are submitted and are in progress at journals and things like that are on my vita, and things that are actually substantially complete, like I have a PDF, I have tech in a PDF file that's not just the title and an abstract, I tend to put on there. But that's a few papers at a time, right? And so what you don't want is the list of things that are in progress to be longer than the things that have actually been completed. You don't want to list 12 papers that you might write in the next 10 years in comparison to the 2 papers that you've actually finished. And so a little bit of realism is sort of helpful there. Your teaching statement expectations vary a lot depending on the sort of job, but it's a personal statement, and I've seen things all over the map. What do you do in the classroom? Do you value teaching? Examples, anecdotes, all these sorts of things. Sometimes they ask for detailed things. What courses did you teach? How big was your classes? Were you the instructor of record or not? What's the teaching evaluation comments? What do the students say? All those sorts of things, come up. Some people really study this closely, particularly if it's a more teaching-focused job. This, of course, gets looked at really closely. Some people really don't look at this at all. And so it just depends on the department, it depends on the situation and all those sorts of things. Having said that, some people look at this closely and so take the time to make this good. And again, this is not something that you should be leaving until the day before the application deadline. This is something you should be starting now, giving it to your advisor to read. Give it to somebody, I shouldn't volunteer her for work, but give it to somebody like Mary Glazer to read. Mary is somebody in this department who does great teaching. And I know she works with a lot of you when you're sort of the first time in the classroom and things like that. And so, she might be somebody who can reflect on that for you, or, I can reflect on that for you, tell you, this is what I see as being strong and weak. Get that sort of feedback from faculty before you're sending it off for jobs. That's what we're here for. We're here for a lot of things, but one of the things we're here for is to, get all of you graduated and get you jobs. And so take advantage of that resource.
What's that hook mean?
Oh, a hook, just in the sense that somebody will decide whether or not they're excited about your candidacy for a position based on your teaching statement. And so a lot of people I know put zero effort into their teaching statements because they're in research active departments and things like that. But what that means is sometimes somebody who's on the committee who's really actually concerned with teaching, whose job on the committee is to make sure that teaching is seen as being important, may look at that cursory teaching statement and say, no, this is somebody we can't hire. And so you don't want your teaching statement, even if you're a research active person, to be bad, right? You want it to be honest. You don't want to say, I love teaching calculus when, you'd rather have a root canal. But you do want it to be presented, it's a job application. You want to present yourself in a good way. And then your research statement for a research active position really makes the difference in the sense of what we're looking for when we're looking for this. First of all, it's some communication. The job hiring committee is not going to be a bunch of people who wrote their PhDs in the same area that you wrote your PhD in. You're not writing for your advisor, you're writing for sort of an average mathematician, because I read these, and I mean in particular I read these for people in sort of applied and computational math, but that's still a broad enough area that I want to be able to understand what's going on in your research statement. And if I can't, then I start to worry about whether or not you can communicate what you're doing for your research. So not too technical. You want to describe in some way your completed research, your ongoing research, and your research vision. What are you going to be doing in 5 years, in 10 years? Is there a progression there? It doesn't have to be definitive, but these are the problems I'm working on now. These are the immediate generalizations of what I'm trying to do now, and this is where it might lead, right? Give some sense that you know what's going on in your field, how your research answers the open questions in your field, and where you might go with those open questions. It's not a binding contract. You don't have to say, oh, I might work on this, or, and then force yourself to work on this, but it gives people an idea of what's going on. If there's good connection, if there's a problem you would work on if you went to this school, then say it, right? This is an opportunity to say, I know how to prove theorem Y in situation X, and if I come here, I can talk to somebody about a different situation, right? And so, those are all sorts of good things. For me, when I look at things that sort of evolved as I applied for jobs at different stages in my life, this is the thing that's evolved the most over time. Because when I was in your stage, I sort of had this very narrow research focus that was my thesis, and then I did some postdoc experience and things like that, and I got broader and broader and broader, and it's not that I've changed the sort of research that I do, but I've changed how I relate to other people's research in my field, and so that's something I want to reflect in this. And so, I still do a lot of the same sort of research I did as a PhD student, but it's now in a very different context. And so it evolves as you sort of get a sense of the bigger picture and things like that. Of course, it also evolves as other people do things, right? In particular, if you prove some great theorem in your PhD and you're applying for a job 3 or 4 years out of your PhD and somebody's used your theorem to do something spectacular, you want to say, hey, that was my theorem, right? Or you want to tell people that your work is being cited by others in the field. Why is your work really important contextually at the time that you're applying for jobs? So that's something that evolves over time. And I just had to rewrite this for my tenure case, and I realized that I still do hate writing these sorts of things. But that's something that really evolved since the last time I'd written one, which was when they hired me here. And so it changes as you sort of go through your career. Questions on that? So, in general, we read a lot of applications. If we have an opening for a tenure track position, or even for a number greener position, at least 50 and more likely 100 to 150 applications here. And I know bigger name schools, it's hundreds of applications, 500 applications even, or something like that. We read a lot of these, and so please write things that we want to read. So be concise. Don't be terse. Don't, be abrupt or just really short, but, don't go on for hours and hours and hours or pages and pages and pages. Give me something that I can read in, your entire application I might spend 10 minutes on if I'm enjoying it. And then I'll go back to it and look at it again and again if I'm really enjoying it. But think about, somebody wants to read what you've written in 10 minutes or less. And so you're not writing 100 pages, and you're not writing 2. It should be your best writing. Check your spelling. Have somebody read it over for grammar. Because if it's badly written or it's hard to read, it doesn't get read. Or it gets read, but it doesn't get read deeply, right? Because somebody looks at it and they're struggling and they're not understanding what you're saying. And so it should be well written. Get people to read it. Get your peers to read it. Get your advisor to read it. Get somebody who's not your advisor to read it. I've certainly read these things for friends and things like that who are in totally different areas of mathematics, just because, and had mine read by people who are in totally different areas of mathematics, just because that's who you're writing for, in some sense. Again, what I want to say is, we read a lot of these, and so you want yours to stand out. And so you want to reinforce what you're saying. You don't want to be repetitive. You want to show connections between different things that come up in different places. You want to be realistic, but show vision. You don't want to say, I will win a Fields medal. But at the same time, you don't want to say, well, I'm not really sure what I'm going to do next. There's a lot of ground between those two sort of ends. And so, that's sort of the general thing that you should be thinking about is people want to read these. They should be well written. They should have been proofread by several people, all those sorts of things. And again, you're going to need all of this stuff. You're going to need all this stuff if these are the jobs you're going for. So start now. Don't need it. So, one more thing. What you really want in terms of your reference letters are strong letters from experts in your field. Right? And so, by the time you're coming up for tenure, you really want those letters because that's what's going to decide whether or not you get tenure. But at the time when you're going for jobs, you want sort of the strongest letters you can get from the best experts you can get. But you don't want a weak letter from a really good expert or a strong letter from somebody who doesn't really know you and isn't really known in the field. Well, whatever you can sort of get in between there. So talk to your advisor, your research mentors, other faculty you worked with closely, people you've taught with, so people who've supervised your teaching. Often you're asked for a letter specifically that addresses teaching. And that's a case where you might talk to Boris or whoever is the chair at the time, or talk to Mary or someone like that about sort of a teaching letter. You can talk to famous people, but again, famous people who know what you've done. And so, that's sort of what you're looking for is famous people are good if they're going to write you a strong letter. Famous people are not good if they're going to write you, and I've seen variations on this. So-and-so asked me to write them a reference letter. Their research seems nice. Signature of famous person. And be aware that different people write very different letters. Some of us, I typically do it with, well, no, that's not true. Some people will just write a letter. You'll ask them to write a letter and they'll just write you a letter. I typically do this one where I say, let me see your CV, your research, and your teaching statement. Let me see what you're selling yourself as so that I can reinforce that in my letter. I think that works really well. Some people will show you the letter and say, is this what you're looking for? It's always a little awkward when you open up that file and you see, Scott is the greatest thing since sliced bread, blah, 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 blah. But, you know, my PhD supervisor is a little absent-minded, and so at some point he wrote me a letter a year after he'd last written me a letter, and, you know, it was like, I mean, it was, you know, I was still a PhD student even though I'd been a postdoc for 2 years or some such thing, you know. And so some people will show you the letter to catch those sorts of things, particularly if they know that they're prone to doing those sorts of things. And some people will ask you to write it or to rewrite it. Some people will say, can you send me a sketch of what you'd like to see in the letter? Or a variation on that that's pretty common is, what would you like me to say? Or if it's somebody who's written you a letter before, what's important that's changed since the last time I wrote you a letter? And so those are sorts of things that you may see. And it depends also on, of course, how well you know the person who's writing you the letter. So, you know, if you're Stephanie, I know what work she's done academically since the last time I wrote her a letter. I better know that. That's my job. And so I won't ask that question, but I do ask that question of somebody I know less well, or whose research I know less well. Communication is the key in this, partly because if you end up at the end of your job search and you don't get a letter from somebody you were counting on a letter from, then bad things happen. We can't consider applicants who send us too few letters. We just can't. And so we have gone out of our way to get a letter after the application deadline because we wanted to consider a candidate. But that's, you know, sort of a special situation where you have 2 letters that say this person is fabulous and you need that 3rd letter. You can go out to try to get that 3rd letter. But if you have no letters, if you have only 1 letter and it's not a really great letter, then you're in trouble if you're the person who was expecting better letters from people who haven't sent them yet. So start early, be clear about the deadlines. Math Jobs is great in this sense in that oftentimes you tell people it just needs to be uploaded in Math Jobs by October 15th. And then that's sort of the instruction that most of us are organized enough to handle.
So they don't have to write different letters for different jobs, it's 1 letter?
For Math Jobs, you get to submit 1 letter, you know, and I usually write to whom it may concern, other people write dearmathjobs.org. That was like that one. You know, and what I typically do is I typically write 1 letter and then I send the generic one to Math Jobs. And then there's always a few places that want the letter sent to somebody else or some other way. And I just send those off, correctly addressed and all that sort of stuff. But, yeah, but and, you know, some people use a secretary for that. I don't know that we do that in this department. I've never done it in this department, but you know, I know of people in departments where you send the generic letter to an administrator, and then so I send my generic letter to the administrator, and the grad student sends the administrator the list of places to send it. And it's the same letter, and it just goes out with different headings, and the signature is electronic. But yeah, so anyway. But this is one where this is deadline specific. We don't want to write your letter a year in advance. We want to write your letter knowing sort of exactly where you are when we're submitting the letter. And so this is one where you want to be clear about timelines and all of those sorts of things, and also about your expectations. Most jobs will ask for 3 letters, especially at the sort of the first job after your PhD level. If there's a good reason to send 4 letters, you can send 4 letters. If there's a good reason to send 5 letters, you can send 5 letters. There's probably not a good reason to send more than 5 letters. I've seen it. I've seen 7 or 8 letters. And it's just, I don't know, it just doesn't do anything for me. It doesn't make me more excited about your candidacy because you found 8 people to tell me that you were a good candidate. Especially when I don't know some of them. If you just sent me the 3 famous people, I would have been just as happy.
One of them's your mom.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. It's weird if you're applying for a job just out of your PhD and you don't have a letter from your PhD supervisor. It's okay. And if there's a reason for it, you might want to say that like in your cover letter or something like that. But it's weird, right? I mean, your PhD advisor doesn't think well enough of you to write a good letter for you. And so, you know, typically it's your PhD advisor, a teaching letter, which will be, you know, the department chair or a teaching person in the department. And then, you know, one more from either somebody else in the department who's in the same research area, or if you worked a lot with an external collaborator, you did an internship with somebody or something like that, that could be a 3rd letter. And you know, if you've done an internship or something, that might be a case to have 4 letters. You have 2 research letters in the department, 1 teaching letter in the department, and an external research letter or something like that. But that's sort of what you should be targeting when you're at that stage, is 3 or 4 letters. Sometimes for senior people, you'll see ads looking to hire a full professor, and they'll be asking for 5 or 6 letters, because if you're really getting hired as full professor level, you should be getting 5 or 6 letters from famous people. But that's a very different situation than you're going to be in anytime soon. So I think that's all that I have to say, except to be realistic. There's lots of applications, there's lots of applicants out there, and so stand out. Use contacts, ask for advice, be professional, of course, and try and make sure that everything you do gets read. Interview, we've been going for a little while here. But basically you're doing all of this in a day or 2. They're 12 to 14-hour days where you give a talk, you meet with the dean, you meet with the department chair, you meet with other faculty, maybe you meet with grad students, you do a tour of the campus. Campus tours are fun. And you eat a lot of really good meals with a lot of people. And so oftentimes this happens 1 or 2 days, 12-hour day, 14-hour day. You're on your feet from 8 a.m. till 9 p.m. or something like that. Breakfast, talk, interview people, lunch, talk with other people, meet with a dean, go for dinner. You can have drinks at dinner. People don't always know this, but we offer very explicitly. You get to dinner, you've had this long day, have some wine. And you'll see advice that says, don't drink any alcohol. If you're the sort of person who gets plastered after 1 drink, don't drink any alcohol. But I would certainly have a beer or a glass of wine or something over dinner, and I think you can feel comfortable to do that as well. That's one of those things that doesn't always get said.
If you get an interview, do you know how many people, or do they invite in for an interview?
You don't always know. Typically 3 to 5, I would say, and more often 3. So we here on this campus have a policy that we interview 3 people for a job. And so we take that whole 100 whatever people who've applied, we whittle it down to about 20 that we're serious about, and then we argue over the top 5 within that 20. Those 5 people all get vetted by the administration. They say, if this is the person that you decide is the best qualified for your job, we will support hiring this person. And then we interview we ask the top 3 for interviews, and if one of them says no, then we move to number 4. And if one of the top 4 people says no, we move to number 5, and things like that. So yeah, but typically it's 3 people that we bring in. And that's true in a lot of places, but it does vary. Yeah. And so at the interview, it's not all about your CV, it's also about being a good person. So, are you as good as you look on paper? Would you be a good colleague in that department? Can you teach? All of these sorts of things. So, dress well. I have and I would dress like this. I sometimes wore a tie when I interviewed, but not all the time. Be articulate, be friendly, smiles get you a long way. Don't be... I don't know if any of you were here for this, but there was this guy who showed up for an interview here. Showed up like 2 hours late, didn't say anything about why he was late. He was wearing a button-down shirt, which was, sort of what you want to aim for if you're a guy. Over top of a t-shirt, and the button-down shirt wouldn't button all the way, so it was only buttoned like to his bottom of his sternum, and then it was open below that because he had a bit of a beer belly. And he was kind of rude and a little bit arrogant, and yeah, he didn't get a job. So we're mathematicians, right? Nobody expects you to be dressed to the nines or to be fully extroverted or anything like that, but we do expect you to convey the sense that you would be a nice person to have around, because that's what we're looking at, right? We're hiring somebody who's going to be our colleague for the next 30 years. And so, we want somebody who we want to actually come into work and see every day for the next 50 years. Or at least appears to be that person. And so, smiles get you a long way, right? You appear a whole lot friendlier if you're smiling than if you're looking dour. And dressing well, again, this is sort of dressing well for a mathematician, right? I have a kid, so now I have a kid. And so, I do often look at myself in the morning and make sure that I don't have, spit up or banana or something hanging off of my clothes. And that should also be true when you're going for an interview. You shouldn't be wearing dirty clothes or things like that. It happens, I've seen it happen. And all those sorts of things. So yeah. Questions on that? And then you're going to give a job talk. It's different from anything else you're going to do because you have a lot of goals in this, in that you're trying to show people that you can teach, that you can communicate, that your research is worthwhile, that you know something, that you're going to convince the experts in your field that you're good, and the people who aren't experts in your field that you know something. And so not everybody's going to walk out of there with your whole message, but everybody should walk out of there with the impression that you're a good communicator, you know what you're doing, all those sorts of things. So the general framework is you want to start by explaining the main ideas in your field. I start by explaining that I solve linear systems. I solve AX equals B, and then I would move on and say, this is why Gaussian elimination that you teach your undergrads is not the algorithm you want to use. I use this in my job talks, I use this when I go and give a colloquium and things like that, because you're talking to that broad audience, you want to start at that level of, you're a mathematician who teaches undergraduate, lower level undergraduate courses, here's something you know, and now I'm going to move into the more specialized. So steer towards your specialty, the broad picture of your research, why is your research important, and also the specifics of your contribution. It's always important in a job talk to say, this is what I've done. And so you want to see, if you've got published works, you want to see citations to those published works. If it's things that are in your thesis, you want it to be clear that this is your thesis. Particularly if your thesis builds on something else, you want to make it clear what's your contribution versus what was somebody else's contribution. What did your advisor do? What are you doing now? Right? You want to make it clear that you've made a serious contribution. And you want to explain as to why your contribution is worthwhile. Right? And that's something, in my area of mathematics, it's always, a Beamer or PowerPoint type presentation. In other areas of mathematics, it's often a chalk talk, right? And so that's a thing that you can ask your advisor for more advice about, or things like that, in terms of those sorts of specifics. But if it's a chalk talk, you have however many pieces of paper you need to talk for 45 minutes. And unlike what I'm doing now, you want to not go over time. You want to talk for 45 minutes. You want to show good board work, organization, all that sort of stuff. You don't want to walk in with 12 pieces of paper that are, folded up and wrinkled and, torn corners and all that sort of stuff, and then be standing here going, oh, it's this page that I need to talk about next. And then get to the punchline and say, oh, I forgot to prove the lemma that was on my second page of notes. You want to be organized enough that it convinces people that you're an organized person, even if you aren't. That's the real trick, right? You want to show people that you're capable of being organized. And you want to ask lots of questions about the job and the university. So what are the expectations in terms of teaching, class sizes, all those sorts of things? What's the department like? Are there seminars? Do people do things together? Technology, what's the library like on campus? What are the tenure expectations? This is a time to ask about tenure. What are the tenure rates? People have asked me about the tenure rates, and I have to be embarrassed and say that I don't know them. But I can, at least when we've interviewed for a tenure track position, I can always point people to Misha because she's usually on the committee as well, and she knows these things. But somebody on the committee should know what the tenure rate is. It's really high at Tufts. I mean, we don't hire people who aren't going to get tenure. And lots of people will say that, right? They say, we're not going to hire you if we don't think you're going to get tenure. That's generally a good policy. Not every school is like that. Some of our neighbors down in Cambridge are not like that. All of our neighbors down in Cambridge. And you kind of want to get a sense of, are people happy, right? If everybody is miserable, you might want to know that. I mean, maybe you like that. But if everybody is really miserable, you kind of want to know that everybody's really miserable, right? And really miserable in the sense that they have bad support, or the students really have a poor attitude, or whatever part of the jobs that are important to you, you want to know that people are happy with those sorts of things. You don't ask about salary. You don't ask who else they're interviewing. And you don't ask, or they don't ask you about where else you're interviewing. I had that happen once, and it was really awkward. Because it's illegal. And so I just had to say, you're not allowed to ask me that. And that was an awkward point in the conversation.
Do you have to answer questions about your personal life?
No. They can't ask you if you're married, they can't ask you if you have kids, they can't ask you any religion, anything like that. So those are in the US, and that's generally true internationally, they are not allowed to ask you any specifics about your personal life, or about your other interviews or anything like that. again, if you have a spouse who is also a PhD or something like that, this may be a chance to bring that up in conversation. I didn't hear when I interviewed here, because my wife already had a job in town, and so it wasn't really an issue. That was why I was interviewing here. When I interviewed here, I interviewed at another school, the person who was hosting my interview at the other school, there's usually somebody who's in charge of your schedule, knows my wife. And so they knew that was an issue, and that was something that sort of came up naturally in conversation. But they can't ask, and if they do ask, you can choose to not answer. And I think that's really important, is to know that you don't have to answer those questions, because people are really prying, and it's supposed to be about your professional sort of things, and we're not making decisions of who to hire based on those other sorts of decisions. And in fact, here, and again at most schools, the rules of the search are set up to make it very clear that we cannot take those things into account. We have to justify why we can hire people, and if it's a female candidate, and the people in the Equal Opportunity Employment Office get any hint that we chose to not hire a female candidate because of a child or a spouse or something like that, that's the sort of thing that we could get fired over as faculty. And so, we're very, very careful to steer clear of those sorts of things.
At what point in the process is it appropriate to ask or even negotiate about salary?
When they've made you an offer.
Okay.
Do I have another slide? No. Well, I do have another slide, but it's not relevant to that. Things change when you go from being an applicant to having an offer. And when they make you an offer, that's the point where you negotiate on salary, on startup, on leave, on teaching expectations. All of those sorts of things are now open. You can ask, and people will say no, but starting date is negotiable, up to about a year. Most schools won't go past, so if the job was for September 1st, 2012, most schools will allow you to start in January 2013 or September 2013. Most schools won't go beyond that, because they feel like if you don't want to be there for that long, then you don't want to be there. And they're concerned about your commitment at that stage. Salary you can always negotiate. I negotiated here about 10% up from the offer they first made me, which meant that I asked for 20% off from the offer they first made me, and we agreed on 10. I negotiated a startup package here that was much bigger than the one that they first offered me. Different schools will have different standards. Some schools say our standard startup package in mathematics is N dollars, where N is usually measured in tens of thousands, but not many of them.
So what is a startup package?
So startup package, right. So that's a great question, actually. So the startup package is money that you control the spending of. And so different schools have different restrictions on it, but here, for example, it's money that I can spend on conference travel, hiring students either for the summer or RAs or things like that during the academic year, memberships for academic organizations and things like that. Sometimes you can pay yourself summer salary out of your startup package, and sometimes not. Basically, and books is a big one. Office furniture, depending on computers and all that sort of equipment that you need. All of those sorts of things are things that come from your startup package.
And it's university funds?
It's money that comes. So I have an account within the university, right? Just like OGSM or whoever, and I control the spending on that account, and it has N dollars in it that we're. And at various schools, you get some refresh based on other sorts of things. So it's not that I had N dollars in it on day one, and it's just going steadily downhill. It goes up a little bit every year, and then it goes downhill again as I spend things. But so in any area of mathematics, at a research active department, I think you should be. I don't know what the numbers are nowadays, but I would guess that at least 10 or 20K is got to be the norm. In the sense that you need to buy a computer, you want to be able to go to conferences in your first year, and all those sorts of things. But I really don't know what the numbers are. In my area of mathematics, because there's computer equipment and there's the expectations that we're writing research grants and doing things as if we have research grants, and so you need the money to act as if you have research grants until you've been there long enough to get research grants. And so in my area of mathematics, those numbers are more like 50K or higher. In engineering and in biology, where you're expected to have a lab and things like that, I mean, those numbers go easily into the hundreds of thousands, and $500,000, $1 million is not unheard of. Sometimes for a more senior person or for somebody who needs very specialized lab equipment.
Do those get replaced as you get grants? Like the grant?
So the money never goes away.
Okay, it just gets supplemented.
So you just, yeah, exactly. And so in fact, I had a startup package, and because I got a grant early in the time that I was here, I didn't spend as much off my startup package in the first 2 years as I had planned, and so I still have a little bit of money.
Does every tenured or tenure track faculty here have a startup package?
So they may have had one when they started, and they may not have. This is also something that's evolved dramatically in the last decade or so. As a way of attracting faculty, you now offer startup packages, whereas I think 20 years ago it was exceptional to get one. But every faculty member in this department, every tenure stream faculty member in this department has a personal account, and Tufts has a policy that we all get like $1,000 a year into that account to spend on books or conference travel or whatever we want. Computers are often separately from that, and that there's a central budget for computers. It's the same one that replaces the computers in your office every decade or two. And then other things happen. So at Tufts, if you have an undergrad summer student that's funded by the central administration, you get some money in your research account. So it's a carrot that they use to get us to do things that they would like us to do. Is they say, oh, if you do this, we'll put $500 in your research account. It's a very effective one because that $500 is enough to pay for a registration at a conference or things like that. So it would be very uncommon at a research active department to not have some sort of small general expenses account that starts out as a fairly big one and goes down once you sort of get established. And so now I put more things on grants than I do on my general account. But that's also field specific and all those sorts of things. I don't need to say this again.